Welcome to Data Ethics Professional webinar number 3 on consent management platforms. Before we start, I just want to let you know this webinar is going to be recorded and it's going to be shared via social media, by our email newsletter, and also archived on the ODI website. One of the things I think we're keen to do, especially if participants are willing, is link their webinar to their bio on our Data Ethics Professionals directory. And also, I think it's going to serve as a really useful resource for people who want to know more about specific data ethics issues. So I know we have some data ethics professionals, alumni in the audience here. If any of you are interested in doing a webinar like Hugh is, please do reach out because we'd love to have you. And we'll, of course, link it to your bio on our directory. So as we carry on with this webinar, we've actually got 2 places that there can be questions. One is in the chat and one is in the Q&A. So if you see on Zoom, like at least where it appears on mine, it's on the sort of banner thing. You can put the Q&A, like any questions in there, and we'll keep an eye on those. Those are probably the easiest place for us to see them. If you put it in the chat, we'll try and keep an eye there as well. So Q&A is probably my preference because then they're all sort of collated in one place. So today's speakers, well, there's me. I'm the Senior Learning Specialist and Data Ethics Consultant at the ODI. So I run a lot of the Data Ethics Professionals courses, along with my colleague, Dr. David Tarrant. And so our speaker today is one of the alumni of the course, a certified data ethics professional, Hugh Gage. Hugh is the founder of Engage Digital and Associates. So with 30 years of experience, Hugh and Engage Digital and Associates help businesses across a wide variety of sectors turn website data into actionable insights through expert digital analytics, data ethics, customer feedback, and seamless data collection. He's also a keen ultramarathon trail runner and father of identical twins. So without any further ado, over to you, Hugh. We look forward to hearing all about consent management platforms.
All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Brilliant. All right, well, thanks, Kay, for that introduction. It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me along to do this. And thank you to everybody who's given up their lunch hour to join the session. I hope you're going to find it very thought-provoking. So with that, we'll dive straight in. Hang on a minute. There we go. And I think I have to start with a little bit of an overview of what consent management platforms are. So I expect many of you will be familiar with them by virtue of the banners that you see at the bottom of websites that you visit, or sometimes they overlay the websites or they sit to the side. And they're often colloquially referred to as cookie banners. But they're basically, CMPs are basically designed to help website owners comply with data protection laws such as GDPR, CCPA, e-privacy, and so forth. And they do that by giving users control over the data that's collected about them. And they do that by controlling third-party plugins that sort of operate on your website. And those third-party plugins often use cookies either as part of their functionality or as a sort of end result. You know, they collect data. So the cookies are there to collect data, either to make those plugins work or as a sort of an output in themselves. So of course we really need to think about what cookies are. And in the top right there I've got an example of a Google Analytics cookie. But essentially, cookies are small pieces of code that are stored in a user's web browser, and they retain data about the user and they share it with a cookie provider. And they come broadly in sort of 2 flavors. You've got cookies that are accessed in the first party, and those are generally associated with the website's domain. That is to say, the domain on the website that the user is looking at, and they're often related to essential functionality. So that might be, for example, if you're on an e-com site, could be what users have got stored in their shopping carts, so retaining what they've got stored in their shopping carts. Or it could be to help remember the login status. And then you have cookies that are accessed in the third party, and those are generally related to advertising, and they're used for sort of tracking user behavior and profiling them. And perhaps sort of, the best example is, all the ads that you see following you around the internet once you've looked at sort of a product on an e-com site, that's as often as not likely to be due to a third-party cookie that's been set on your browser. So how do CMPs function? I think the first thing to say is that CMPs, consent management platforms, are generally implemented using something called a tag management system. And probably the biggest and most widely used of these is Google Tag Manager. So as I mentioned earlier, users will first be aware of a CMP on a website if they see a banner. And I've got here an example of the banner that you can see on the ICO's website. And actually this one loads from the side and not the bottom. And this is the first instance in which a user will be aware that, or they might be aware of a CMP. They probably wouldn't know what it is, a CMP. They just sort of see it as possibly a nuisance. But anyway, here you can see they're given a pretty sort of binary choice, either reject non-essential cookies or accept non-essential cookies. And this is the first step in the data collection process. And as you can see here on this particular banner, users also have the opportunity to modify what cookies, or not so modify the cookie, but modify their selection. And they can either sort of select analytics cookies and turn that on, or select video player cookies. But this is where they get to make that decision at the first instance. And then based on the preferences that they make, by virtue of the choice they make on this banner, what then happens is the CMP will allow those scripts that I was talking about before to either load or not load according to the decision that the user makes. And when the script loads, then the cookies relating to those scripts will also be set on the user's browser. So now thinking of that in terms of ethical frameworks. So there are a few different ethical frameworks that might be, that you might consider here. Certainly in my sort of thinking, there are about 6, but these are the ones that I find particularly helpful. And I'm not saying this in a prescriptive way. You might sort of feel that there are others that are more relevant to your particular situation, but the deontological framework pretty much deals with regulatory requirements, so things like GDPR and so forth. And I think most people, when they're thinking about user privacy, kind of gravitate towards the regulatory requirement because of the penalties, potential for penalties if you're found to be in contravention of them. And so your in-house legal counsel and your DPO will very much skew towards the sort of, in an ethical perspective, a deontological view. But I don't think that's the whole story. And so I kind of think of it in terms of a rights-based view and these other two frameworks, and the utilitarian view. And the rights-based view, I think of, when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in particular Article 12, which states no one shall be subject to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, or home or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor or reputation. So essentially, it's saying that we all have a right to our privacy. And in fact, when you think about it, the legal frameworks might change all around the world in different regions. So regardless of what those legal frameworks are, if you subscribe to, and if you sort of adhere to things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then you accept that users have a right to privacy, and that right, from an ethical point of view, is embodied in the rights-based view that we have here. And then there's the utilitarian view, and this is something that I think is of particular interest because this balances the needs of both the user, in other words, people who are visiting your site, and the be it a business organization, stakeholders in that organization. Also, in my view, gives rise to another ethical principle, and that being pluralism. So what's pluralism? So pluralism is a situation in which you might have multiple opposing views that can be held at the same time, but can be equally valid. So in this instance, I'm thinking of the privacy of the user, and then I'm also thinking about the needs of the business to collect data. And when I'm thinking about that, I kind of think, well, okay, so you often hear this sort of statement that data is becoming the new oil. And I think when people say that, they think about it in terms of crude oil, the sort of hydrocarbon that's driven the world's economy for the last 150 odd years. But if you think about it just in terms of a lubricant, like 3-in-1, data is there to help businesses function better and to give them a competitive advantage. And if you degrade the quality of that data, or if you reduce it, then you run the risk of reducing the ability of your organization to act competitively. And if you do that, then I suppose if you extend that thought process, you also risk the possibility that your business becomes uncompetitive and you have to make redundancies. And the knock-on effect from that could be people who can't pay their mortgages, they can't pay their bills, they can't pay childcare. And so these are all people who I think have a stake in the business, and in that sense, they are sort of stakeholders themselves. And so I think that the ethics around what happens to them are almost as relevant, or at the very least shouldn't be ignored. I think the other thing to consider here is that if you operate in a multinational organization, then you will find that the laws are different, from region to region. So we have obviously the CCPA, we have GDPR over here, and they're perhaps sort of, more similar. But and I'm not a legal person, so I don't know about all the different laws around the rest of the world. But it's certainly the case that they'll be different, and of course, people's values are different as well. So I think that you can't just sort of adhere strictly to the legal framework and the deontological ethical framework. You need to take into consideration these other ethical aspects that I've mentioned. But if you were to take a belt and braces approach to this, then you'd probably just sort of, from a legal point of view, you'd just adhere to the most stringent legal framework, which might be something like GDPR, and then you'll know that you're kind of covering at least that aspect of it wherever users are in the world. So let's think about CMP implementation for a second. And here I want to cover off two things. I think there's the back end and then there's the front end. And so when I'm thinking about the back end, I'm thinking about how CMPs, when you set them up, the first thing that will happen is that they will do a scan of your website and they will search for all the potential cookies that can be set. And then they will classify those cookies. And I've given 4 different classifications down the right-hand side there. You've got strictly necessary, which is required for the website to function. You've got functional, which just sort of enhances the user experience. And then you've got performance-based cookies, which are essentially analytics cookies. And then you've got your targeting cookies, which are the advertising cookies I talked about before. And at this point, once it's scanned your site, you might think some of these cookies have been misallocated. And at that point, you might feel, well, it's, there are some that you prefer to put in a different sort of bucket. And I'll come on to that in a second. So I'll just take a bit of water. And you might feel that some of those cookies need to be reclassified. But before I talk about that and the complexities around that, I just want to address the sort of front-facing aspect of this, which is, of course, the cookie banner. And I've given an example of one up in the top right-hand corner here. And the organization that sets this cookie banner, I would say, have taken a sort of more utilitarian approach, insofar as, from a UX point of view, a user experience point of view, you can see that they're sort of steering people towards accepting all cookies, but they're not ignoring the fact that users have a right to privacy, and they have, they should be able to set their own preferences. So, whilst they're kind of it seems to me as though this organization accepts the value of data and would like to collect that data, but they appreciate that it's not as binary as that. So if the user accessing the site would is keen to sort of set their own preferences, then they come through to another screen like this. And at this point, this organization has taken the very reasonable view that they should start with the premise that the user probably wants to, or at least they ought to, ethically speaking, start from the principle that all cookies are rejected. And at this point, then the user has to actually opt in to say accept analytics cookies or accept third-party cookies. So that to me strikes a balance between the needs of the organization to collect data and the requirement to respect the privacy of the user. So I think that's a perfectly reasonable way forward to approach that. But thinking about the complexity of cookie categorization now, and this is going back to the earlier point I was talking about, I'm going to use the example of a tool called Monetate, and this is essentially a split testing tool, and it allows website owners to serve up variants of different web pages and to see which one is the most effective and the most relevant for its users. It can also be used in, which is to say, if the website operator has long theory, uses Monetate to make those changes more quickly. So if and Monetate is the kind of script that would probably be classified as functional. So in other words, the cookies for Monetate would be classified as functional. And so if you're using Monetate to serve up content that might be critical to the functioning of the site, and also might be vital for the user experience, and if, for the sake of argument, that was classified as functional, and if a user then rejected functional cookies, then that might seriously degrade the user's experience on the site and degrade the site's ability to kind of perform the role that it's doing there. And so at that point, you might think, well, maybe this cookie needs to be reclassified. Maybe it needs to be strictly necessary in order for to get what they are here to do, and in order for the site to fulfill its purpose. But it's not a cut and dry issue. And at that point, I think you would want to obviously have your legal department involved, your DPO involved. And you need to be thinking about this from a regulatory perspective, as well as from the perspective of the user, and also the perspective of the business or the organization. So the point being that, and I'm not going to, say what I think is the right way forward with this, because this is just an example, and I simply bring it up to illustrate the point that as you're setting up your CMP, you might find that the classification that you have for those cookies doesn't really fit, and there are some instances where they might need to be changed, and you need to think about that from the different sort of ethical perspectives that are involved there. So let's have a look at a couple of examples here. FaceWatch is one that I love because FaceWatch is an interesting business. It uses a back-end database and software to identify potential. And I mean, to my mind, they probably are quite aware of how kind of, I don't know, emotive or what people might think about that kind of product, because there are clearly issues of privacy, potential issues of privacy, if you get that kind of database wrong. So I think what they're doing here is interestingly, they don't look to me taking a utilitarian approach, or look to me as though they're adopting a sort of an ethics of care approach to this, to their the way that they've implemented their banner here, at least. And by which I mean they are focusing entirely on the needs of the user and building trust with that user. And they've been very transparent, and transparency is another key aspect of data ethics. And they've been incredibly transparent here. So they've done a couple of things. Firstly, they haven't really given the user an option. They've what they're presenting here, but the reason is everything is switched off. You can see the cookies that they're really kind of proposing to be set are these necessary cookies. Preferences, statistics, marketing, that's all switched off. And so I think what they're trying to do here is to build trust with people who are coming to their website, possibly for the first to find out about their products. And they're trying to do that myself. And that's how they're doing it. So they're steering people very much in that direction. If, of course, users do want to, decide they want to give the business some data, then they will see, they can click on show and they can see the different classifications, they can see what those classifications relate to, and then they can see the kind of cookies that are being. So they've taken a very transparent approach to this, and I think they sort of touch at one end of the spectrum where they're being completely open and honest with their users and respecting the privacy of the user from a narrative. Another example at the other end of the other end of the and I'm opt-in banner, and it's a message that just sort of says, we use cookies, and if you are going to continue using our website, then we assume you're happy with it, and if you don't like it, then kind of don't use the website, as it were. So this isn't really compliant under any kind of regulatory framework. I would not personally say it's compliant in any kind of ethical framework either, and the user hasn't got any choice, and there's very little transparency here either. I mean, you can access the privacy policy, and I've done that, and the privacy policy doesn't really say much about cookies. It just sort of describes what a cookie is, but it doesn't say what cookies they use or how they use them, and there's no real choice, so the user has no choice. And so the question then is, well, what are they actually doing? And I checked this out, and it turns out that regardless of what the user does with that banner, whether they allow cookies or not, they're setting cookies anyway. So, it may be that they just haven't thought about this, and this could be completely unintentional. But just to give you an example of sort of what's happening at the other end of the spectrum, this is not compliant, in my view. It's certainly not compliant from a regulatory perspective, but I don't think it's really compliant from an ethical perspective, because they're not giving any kind of transparency, and they're not giving the user any choice. So on that subject of transparency builds trust, and trust is pretty much the number one factor governing whether users are prepared to share their data or not. So I think, and it's a key principle of, as I said, it's a key principle of data ethics. So I think that, if you take the example of FaceWatch, they have very much, they've gone all out on their transparency. They've been very clear about what they're doing with cookies. They describe their cookies pretty clearly, and they give users a very clear choice. And if you look at what the ICO are doing, again, they've been very transparent. It's a very clear binary choice, accept all cookies or reject all non-essential cookies. So, and I think that when you're thinking about how you set up your CMP, when you're thinking about transparency, you're really talking about that first point of interaction where the user makes that choice, and that is your cookie banner, your consent banner. And being transparent, you could argue, because it builds trust, can also help you build a sort of competitive advantage on that basis. So then just a quick word on data cleansing then. And this is, it's not really an afterthought, but in a sense it is, because data cleansing in the context of configuring a CMP, a cookie consent banner, it's not the first thing you might necessarily think about, because you don't have any data when you're in the configuration process. You're setting it up so that you can collect data. So at this point, you're really thinking about what kind of data you're collecting, how important is that to the business or the organization, how long do you propose to hold that data for, and what could that data be used for in, say, sort of a few months' time or even a few years' time, and actually you need to be thinking about how might it accidentally be incorrectly used. I was going to say abused, but I think that'd be a bit strong. But how could it be incorrectly used? And you want to try and mitigate those circumstances, but be thinking about that up front. So it's not directly relevant to the actual configuration of the CMP, but it is relevant in terms of thinking about the output thereafter. So when you're setting up your CMP and thinking about that process, you will need to do a consequence scanning, or I know it would be a good idea to run some consequence scanning, which is essentially a risk assessment. And I mean, there are many ways you can do this, but the ODI, and this isn't a plug for the ODI, I might add, it's a tool that I've used and I've tested it, and it's actually pretty good. I liked it. The ODI, I've had it running for about a year now, I think, and it's essentially a risk assessment tool. It's called consequence scanning. So you put in all your requirements, and it uses AI to help with the output, and we'll see that in a second. But you put in all your requirements, so all your stakeholders, what you're looking to achieve, maybe even some of the regulatory frameworks that you think could be applicable in the different regions that you're operating in. It's essentially sort of a giant prompt for a large language model. So you put that in, and it will then produce an output which might look a little bit like this. So you've got series of consequences. You've got some projected outcomes, or some possible outcomes. What the potential impact with those would be, and the likelihood, what you should do about it, and then some suggested actions. So if you take the top line here first, we've got potential privacy breaches due to misconfiguration or bugs in the CMP. So perhaps, I don't know, you have a script that fires before user's been given permission, and then depending on what that script is there to do, and the date and the cookie that it's setting, and the type of data that's collecting, that could be potentially a fairly negative outcome if that's happening, as I say, before the user's given consent. What could the impact of that negative outcome be? It could potentially be quite high. What's the likelihood of this actually occurring? Well, that depends on how rigorous you are when you're setting up your CMP. But let's say, for example, it's sort of mid-level, and then it says, well, it gives you a sort of, what should you do? You should act on it, and it gives you some recommendations. So in this case, this is all probably stuff that you would do in any event, but it's nice to see it all listed out here, and it's very helpful. In this case, it's suggesting that you set up a rigorous QA process, run regular audits, and assign a QA team, quality assessment team, and then continue to run those audits over time. I think that's probably something that's worth mentioning. You should continue to run those audits because, once you've set up your CMP, it isn't the case that that's it done and you're dealt with it. You're probably going to have other scripts that you're going to want to load into it, at various points in the future. And when you do that, it makes sense then to go over the whole consequence scanning process again and look at the ethics of each of those individual scripts as you bring them on. So in summary, at a very top level, I would say think beyond the regulatory framework. I mean, it's easy to sort of think about privacy in terms of the penalties if you get it wrong, and I think that's absolutely right, and I wouldn't argue against that. But because the regulatory frameworks differ around the world, and because our values differ as well, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the right thing to do for both ourselves and for people visiting our site, and irrespective of what the law says. So we have to obviously comply with the law, but we also have to think about what is the right thing to do from these other perspectives. Focus on building transparency, and that starts with the consent banner. That's the first point of contact that users will have when it comes to data collection and their control over it and privacy. And if you can be transparent in how you're communicating what data you're collecting, how you're doing it, which cookies are involved, and what they're being used for, and the more that you can put in there, I would say, the better. Then you're being more transparent, and you're most likely building more trust with your users as they come onto your site. So, those would be the key things that I would say you'd want to consider as you're going through this process. So I think that's it from me. We have time for some Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hugh. That's really, really informative and insightful. We've got a few questions that have come in. So I think I'm going to take them in order because they sort of tackle some of the different aspects of things that you've asked. So the first question is from Martin, and he said, as ethics go beyond what is legally required, is it ethical not to have a reject non-essential cookies option? I would argue trackers are never ethical, and that there's no such thing as a legitimate interest vendor based on the UDHR. Thoughts on that? Do we need a reject non-essential cookies option?
Yes, I think we do. I mean, I think you have to give users the option to reject them. I mean, if the question is, should they be rejected automatically without having that, then then that's one way of doing it. And I think that's the FaceWatch example, except they've obviously, I mean, in a sense, you could argue that that's exactly what they've done. They haven't. They basically just rejected non-essential cookies. They've already got them switched off, and they are going down the route of just assuming that the needs of the user are more important than the needs of their business, and I guess they're using that as a way of building trust. But I wouldn't want to be the person that say, no, I don't think that that's. I think that the narrative that that all trackers are the devil's work is understandable, but not one that I would personally subscribe to, because I think they serve a purpose from the businesses or from the organization's point of view. I just think that you've got to be super clear how they're being used, and as I say, make sure that you've got as much transparency there as possible, and give your users an option to opt out. One thing that I've noticed that some sites don't do is when users have made their choice, the consent banner will disappear, and in some instances you might see an icon in the bottom right or bottom left of the corner so that the user can change their preferences. Now, it's unlikely if they're rejecting everything they're going to want to change back to sort of accepting, but if they've accepted cookies and they subsequently want to reject them, it's not so easy to do if that icon is not there. So some access to the accept reject options after they've made their initial choices, I think, is important, and I don't always see that as I'm in my experience.
It's really interesting that you talk about their sort of the website's reaction to your choice, because Hugh and I were discussing this earlier when we were setting up the webinar, and there's a newspaper that I read that actually does something that even goes beyond that, where if you reject third-party cookies, it actually says something like rejection hurts, and it sort of plays on your emotions a little bit, and then it makes the point that as a newspaper that helps fund their work. And I wonder if you have any comments on that, Hugh.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of newspapers sit behind, or a lot of content on some newspapers sits behind paywalls now, and they just give you a bit for free. And so, but for those other organizations, those other papers, like perhaps The Guardian, where I don't think they have a paywall, they just ask you to sort of help contribute, that they will make a fair bit of their money off advertising. And, they need to, in order for them to be able to continue doing the journalism that they do, they need to be able to pay their way, and a substantial part of that is the advertising revenue that they collect, and they need the data to be able to sell effective advertising to organizations that want to advertise on their site. So, and we, a lot of people read The Guardian, they look at it, they hold themselves as a sort of bastion of investigative journalism, and if we want that sort of content to remain freely available to us, then we have to engage with that. And it's kind of, it speaks slightly to what is known as the data value exchange. Do people, how do people balance the value that they hold over privacy and the value that they hold over what they're getting sort of in exchange for the data they're giving up? I think the other thing, to your point, Kay, is that sometimes when you reject all cookies, you get taken through to a screen, or if you want to set your own cookie settings, you go into the cookie settings, and then you get a long list of cookies. And at that point, and some of them, quite often they're either all switched on, or some of them are switched on and some of them are switched off. and you have to sort of scroll through them and decide which of them. At that point, there's a big kind of a burden on the user as they're going through their selection process. And, they might eventually just say, look, I can't do this anymore. I'm just going to select, accept them all. I would argue that that is not, ethically speaking, that's not in the user's best interest. It doesn't really kind of adhere to an ethics of care framework or it doesn't engender any kind of transparency either, because you're forcing the user to wade through all these different options. Now that also might be unintentional, but I think that when you're thinking about, if you're going down that route, when you're thinking about how you present those options to users, should they want to select which cookies they want to accept and which they want to decline, you need to be as helpful as possible. And again, this comes back to the transparency issue. You need to be as transparent as possible in doing that, and make it as easy as possible as well. Otherwise, it just puts burden on the user.
I want to follow up with that. A few people have mentioned, so I'm going to read a couple of questions that are kind of similar. So Jesus says, one issue with cookie banners is that sometimes they are implemented using dark patterns that bias the user towards less privacy by being confusing in the descriptions, options, or both. What can the user do in these cases from a practical and privacy protecting point of view? Deny every option? Use auto blocking extensions? That was one question. And then another person, Remy says, when you were talking about, I think it was in reference to when you're saying you have to go through and switch everything off, isn't that the same thing as dark patterns manipulating the user? So I wonder if you have any further sort of comments about that.
Yeah, so I understand the points about the dark patterns piece and manipulating the user through the way that you've got your banner designed. And again, I think that it's easy to take a binary view on this kind of thing and to say, well, look, this all appears to be very nefarious. And if we were to take the example I showed earlier, where you've got a button which was sort of light blue and steering the user toward that, versus the option to which is just a link to sort of change their settings, then perhaps that's considered to be not the right thing to do. But again, I would sort of go back to thinking about what are the consequences by extension if you adopt an alternative route to that, where if you go down, let's take, for example, the ICO. The ICO use an analytics platform that's entirely cookieless. And so, if you opt out of cookies, when you opt out of the analytics, you're not actually opting out of an analytics cookie. You're just basically stopping that script from firing. But I'm pretty sure that they used to use, and I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure they used to use Google Analytics on their site, and they've always had that stark choice of either accept or non-essential or reject non-essential. And I think most people will go with reject non-essential. Why would they not? And so I expect that the amount of data that they were collecting just dropped, from terms of how people are using their site, just dropped off a cliff. And they may have sort of finally realized or decided that that wasn't going to work for them, and they did need to find a way in which they could resolve that problem. Now, whether or not their solution with a cookieless banner does that, I should think not. Sorry, not a cookieless banner, a cookieless analytics tool, I should think doesn't, because they're still giving that option. But I think that the question then is, if you give people a very clear option and you take the view of route of being completely even about it, to what extent does that impact your business? And if that data is important to your business, to what extent does that impact the people that work in your business and who rely on your business to make a living? So I do sympathize with the dark patterns bit, but again, I just don't think it's as cut and dry as all that. I don't know if that answers the question for the questioner, but
it's a really interesting point you make. The FaceWatch example is an interesting one, because FaceWatch don't make their money as a business by selling the data they get from their website. So that obviously, from their point of view, maybe it was an easy decision because they were like, look, we sell something that people may have ethical concerns about because it involves facial recognition for the prevention of theft in shops, like by a private organization. So their main purpose is, like, the people who are visiting their website are probably the shopkeepers who are thinking about purchasing the product. So they want to make that point. We are trustworthy. We're doing everything we can to be transparent and trustworthy. Whereas, the other example we gave of a newspaper, they really do make their money by advertising, and that maybe has a bigger financial implication for them if the person opts out. And, I suppose at that point you're into the ethical question of whether denying a newspaper sort of an independent source of funding is an ethically good or bad thing, compared to being funded in some other way. So that's kind of, I guess, where that comes down to.
Absolutely. I mean, if they can't, if they rely, if say, plus 50% of their revenue, and I mean, I don't know what their books look like, but if plus 50% of their revenue comes from advertising, and if you degrade that so that drops right off, then what happens if they are then forced to sell to a wealthy buyer who then wants to project their own views through their newspaper? And we saw that happen, in the US in the last election cycle, and it didn't go well for the owner of the newspaper in question. But it sort of brings into question issues of editorial bias at that point if you've got a sole owner. So I think maintaining that independence, even if it is, even if you're required to do that by using the data that you collect on how people are browsing your website to then sort of serve advertising, maybe a balance worth striking rather than sort of taking a harder line approach to these tracking scripts.
Is there a way to, I guess, determine how much of this would be used in a way that people might find ethically questionable? So let me just give some theoretical examples here. If you had sort of an advertising cookie script that identified you as sort of the type of person who would have young children, so they advertise toys that you might buy for your child, that feels relatively harmless, I guess, compared to if they're like, oh, you are a person who's of the age, like the sandwich generation, you're probably very stressed. Let me advertise like mental health sort of services to you. Those feel like two different types of advertising. Is there any way that an organization can control that through these platforms?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that when you run when you allow when you allow these tracking scripts to run, you can't really control the kind of advertising I mean, I'm not a publisher, so I expect probably there are certain things that publishers can do to say, well, we're not going to have X, Y, or Z kind of advertising running on our site. But I think it's quite difficult to control that via. I mean, it's impossible probably to control that via the CMP. I mean, when the script's running, it's collecting data, it's profiling the user. I think the trouble that you've got there is if you're using a shared machine, and one person in the household might use the machine to use the computer to go and look at one particular thing, and then another person might come on and suddenly start seeing ads for that thing that they really weren't expecting appear to them. But then conversely, would you rather have, if you're looking at it from the point of view of being served relevant advertising, is that better than being served completely irrelevant advertising that's just based off no data about you at all? So again, I don't think it's I just don't think it's particularly cut and dry.
I think you've just addressed one question here, which was, do you have a view about the use of cookies on internet connected TV? Who is really able to give consent on a household device?
Well, I mean, internet connected TV is, I mean, honestly, I've not seen, any kind of consent banner on there doesn't appear to be anything there that I've seen. I mean, we've got one, so I'm thinking about this just from a personal perspective rather than anything else. And yes, I would certainly say that if cookies are being used on internet connected TVs, then there's no reason why the users shouldn't also be afforded the same options to sort of reject tracking there. But having said that, I mean, what are we talking about here? We're talking about things like Netflix, for example. I mean, you're logged into Netflix, so they're going to be profiling what you're looking at anyway. They don't need cookies to do that, really. They can do that because you're basically accessing content from their servers, and that's pretty much how they're building those models. So there may be a slightly different thing there, whether or not you can't use that service without logging in, because of course you have to pay for it. Whether or not there should be something that says, okay, I would like to use the Netflix service without any kind of algorithmic tracking, so that I can't be profiled, so that it's not serving any content to me that is of a particular interest to me. Whether they should have that option available, then I guess arguably they should. But that's sort of slightly outside, as far as I can think about it, outside the realm of consent management platforms. I've certainly have never seen one but I don't browse the internet on my TV, so I guess that's a slightly different thing as well.
Interesting. Now I have some questions here about some changes upcoming. So one question says, if the new UK law allows for an exemption for analytics, do you see a trend of analytics cookies as default on in CMPs, or could there be an argument that they are low risk and or strictly necessary?
That's a good question. Firstly, I think that law is just entering the Lords as of Thursday last week, and I haven't read it, so I don't know too much about what it's proposing in terms of cookies. But I think the questioner's point about analytics cookies being low risk, or at least the observation there, is an interesting one. And whether or not it would provide an exemption or should provide an exemption is, I mean, I work in that business, so I wouldn't be, actually, no, that's not fair. I was going to say I wouldn't be too upset if there were an exemption for them, but at the same time, from an ethics point of view, I believe that users in this country still have a right to be able to understand and know what data is being collected about their browsing habits from the point of view of them being subsequently profiled. But then I also kind of look at that sort of data on a regular basis. And, from the point of view of somebody who analyzes it, it's anonymous. But then there are people in my industry who say, look, no means no. So if a user does not want to be tracked using analytics on a website, and if they say no, then that's it. It shouldn't happen. And we don't collect. GA doesn't collect IP addresses anymore. At least it doesn't store them in a way that's accessible for analysts. So I'm not sure. I really, I think. I don't think it would, if they didn't have an exemption for it, then I don't think I'd be too worried about that. Yeah, sorry, that's not much of an answer.
I think we've actually had another question here. I mean, the theme is, are they going to find a way to wiggle around further regulation, I think, is the theme here. So the other question is, do we think that, are you able to comment at a high level about the changes, ethically, business data-wise, user rights, with the forthcoming changes in browsers, removal of third-party cookies, which actually means that whilst third-party cookies themselves might be removed, the same functionality will be implemented through a different non-cookie technology.
Right. Yeah. So, firstly, Google have rolled back from sunsetting third-party cookies. So they had a history of doing that, and as I understand it, they've kind of rolled back from that again. So I'm not sure that they're going to disappear completely immediately. But I think it's a great question insofar as, it does ask the question, what would happen if they were? And, would it be the case where you would see more tracking via things like fingerprinting, which in my view is a particularly insidious form of tracking. And because it's quite difficult to identify it, and the degree of transparency there is it just sort of drops off a cliff, I think, because it's much harder to see whether somebody is applying fingerprinting to the tracking process. So I would be worried about that. If that suddenly sort of, if a greater instance of that started to occur. But there are analytics tools, for example, that don't use cookies. I mean, like I say, I can't remember what the one that the ICO are using, but they use a cookieless analytics tool. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that certainly from an analytics or website analytics point of view, that you could still continue to do that using cookieless products. But yeah, I mean, I would worry about the fingerprinting side of things. That wouldn't be a great outcome, to be honest.
Just a follow-up question on that from Juliet. Does voice recognition and fingerprint authentication also fall into that? Is that, can you talk a little more about fingerprinting?
Well, I mean, from a CMP point of view, I don't think so, because you're talking largely about rejecting cookies with consent management banners, although actually what you're really talking about is rejecting scripts and then the associated cookies for those scripts. Voice recognition, I mean, I think that's sort of moving a step further away from what we've been talking about today. And actually, when I'm thinking about voice recognition, what worries me way more, and this is a little bit off topic, is the ability of AI to mimic a voice. So, you firstly have to be in a situation where your voice can be recorded, and then you have to be in a situation where and so whether that would happen on a website or on a phone. If we're on a phone, then CMPs are not even in the equation as far as I can think of. But if we're on a website where for some reason you happen to be speaking, I mean, I can't see that happening. So, or at least I can't envisage a situation like that. But if you do find yourself in a situation where you're speaking into something and you don't know what's at the other end, and it's not being identified, that your voice is being recorded in the way that you do when you're setting it up for your bank transaction or to log into your bank, then that's a sort of a scary prospect, because like I say, AI has reached the point now where it can record your voice, and then it could be used to contact members of the family masquerading as you, or even reaching out to your bank. So, but I think that's, as I say, slightly tangential to CMPs, certainly from the voice recognition perspective.
Excellent. Thanks for that. I want to ask, I think we've got one chance for one more question, which is just sort of zooming out a minute. Someone asked this in the Q&A. If you would like to basically judge the ethical stance of a website by their defaults that are already provided in their cookie banner, what is your thought on sort of the default cookie setup that passes GDPR, ICO, CCPA standards, and how is that different from one that really helps you judge the ethics of an organization?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, look, my values, I don't ascribe to everybody else. So I think what I say is just sort of, I mean, I'm talking about my own virtue ethics, as it were. And I look at, and I go back to the FaceWatch example, I look at what they've done, and to my mind, they have very much put the privacy of their user front and center. But then I don't know the reasons why they did that. So from a regulatory point of view, I can't argue with what they've done. I think they've taken absolutely the right approach. In fact, even stronger perhaps than the ICO themselves. And I think that's great. But then if you look at that from an ethical point of view, what's their reason for doing that? Now, if it's to build trust with their users, then that's great. But is there a sort of a more cynical view behind that? Are they looking? But then I can't imagine why there would be, because even if there is a more cynical view behind that, in terms of, well, they just want to kind of present an image to their users that they're highly trustworthy. But what are their actual business practices like? And I suspect they're absolutely fine, and they go to great lengths to protect the privacy of their users, both when they come to their website and also by looking at the content of their database. So I'm not sure that I can make judgments. I can just say what I think looks good, and I think that what they've done looks good and makes sense in that particular context. But if you give me another context, then I would say that that's reasonable as well. And if we go back to the Guardian example, where they need to collect data in order to help them generate revenue, I would say that as long as they're compliant, legally, then I'd say that there's also other considerations ethically which relate to how they need to run their operation to make it function. So I just, I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think you really have to think about this in the context of your own organization, the data you're collecting and how important it is, and then wrap the ethical frameworks around that.
I love that point, Hugh. And I think that's a great one to end on, that it's so context dependent. It depends on the organization. It depends on sort of what they're trying to accomplish. So I'm just going to, if you wouldn't mind, Hugh, just stop sharing. I'll put up our sort of last page. There we go. So thank you all for coming. I think this has been a really insightful, really interesting discussion. And thank you so much to Hugh for sharing his really deep understanding and expertise in this area. I'm sure he's happy to continue the discussion offline if you want to reach out to him. And I just want to point out that our next webinar from a Data Ethics Professionals alumni is going to be on the 30th of April. And it's going to be from an open data manager from a state in the US who is going to talk about how to use demographic data ethically and think about how you can collect it for monitoring impacts without putting individuals at risk. So if you're interested in joining our next cohort of Data Ethics Professionals training, where you learn to use things like the CARE tool, and in fact, you get 6 months of access to the CARE tool through Data Ethics Professionals, our next group starts on the 20th of May, and we actually do have a summer sale going on, so you can scan that QR code. And if you want to keep in touch, please feel free to join the email newsletter. So thank you all so much for your questions and the really vibrant discussion, and I can't wait to see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.